Luke Skywalker's final posture in Return of the Jedi is almost universally read as enlightenment, a serene culmination of Jedi philosophy, where temptation is overcome and balance is achieved, yet that reading depends on equating restraint with resolution and stillness with healing, assumptions that the film's emotional logic quietly undermines if examined without mythic shorthand. Luke does stop himself from striking down Darth Vader, but stopping is not the same thing as processing, and restraint is not the same thing as understanding, because the rage that explodes out of him in the throne room does not emerge from nowhere, nor does it dissolve simply because he chooses not to act on it. What the audience witnesses in that moment is not a confrontation with darkness, followed by integration, but a violent surge followed by an emergency shutdown, an instinctive clampdown that prevents immediate catastrophe, but leaves the underlying emotional fracture unexamined and unresolved. Luke's sudden calm after the outburst reads less like peace and more like containment, a rapid return to discipline that feels practiced rather than reflective, suggesting that what he has learned is not how to live with his anger, but how to silence it before it costs him everything. The visual language reinforces this interpretation, as Luke's demeanour shifts abruptly from feral intensity to monk-like detachment without any intermediate reckoning. No breath, no reflection, no visible acknowledgement of what nearly happened, only control reasserted through posture and declaration. In this light, Luke's refusal to fight is often mistaken for healing when it functions more convincingly as avoidance, a refusal not only to strike but to engage with the implications of his own capacity for violence, choosing moral certainty as a shield rather than a lens. The Jedi ideal. Luke embraces in that moment offers a clean binary, act or refuse, light or dark, control or collapse, but it provides no framework for emotional integration, no space to ask why the rage surfaced or what it demands to be understood, rewarding suppression as virtue rather than reckoning as growth. Luke's calm therefore carries the texture of emotional lockdown, a state familiar to trauma survivors, where feeling less becomes a strategy for staying functional, and where serenity is achieved not by resolution, but by narrowing the range of allowable emotion. This interpretation reframes Luke's black robes not as symbolic mastery, but as visual foreshadowing, a signal that the line between restraint and repression has already blurred, and that his identity as a Jedi is being constructed around control rather than comprehension. The rage against Vader is especially telling because it is deeply personal, rooted in fear, loss, and inherited destiny. And when Luke recoils from it, he does so without naming it, without integrating it into his sense of self, treating it as something alien rather than something that belongs to him. By declaring himself a Jedi and refusing violence, Luke chooses a role over a process, an identity over an inquiry, allowing the narrative to move forward without forcing him to sit with the truth that he is capable of the very darkness he fears, a truth acknowledged only briefly before being buried under ceremony and victory. The throne room therefore becomes not the site of Luke's healing, but the site of his emotional compromise, where survival and moral positioning take precedence over introspection, and where repression is mistaken for transcendence because it produces immediate stability. This misreading is understandable because Star Wars frames myth in absolutes, and because audiences are conditioned to read restraint as maturity, but the cost of that framing is that Luke's inner conflict is paused rather than resolved, creating a fault line that remains invisible only because the story ends before it can be tested. What Luke learns in that moment is how to stop himself, not how to understand himself, and that distinction matters, because unexamined rage does not vanish when denied. It waits, preserved beneath discipline, ready to resurface under conditions of fear, attachment, or perceived failure. Seen this way, the ending of Return of the Jedi is not a conclusion but a suspension, a temporary equilibrium achieved through control rather than integration, leaving Luke outwardly serene but inwardly unfinished, a Jedi who has mastered restraint without mastering reconciliation. That unresolved tension becomes invisible only because the narrative closes, allowing myth to overwrite psychology and victory to obscure the quiet truth that Luke has locked away a part of himself he does not yet know how to face. When the immediate danger passes and the myth declares victory, Luke's unresolved interior does not disappear with the Emperor's fall, it simply loses urgency, And that loss of urgency is precisely what allows suppression to masquerade as peace. Because without a present crisis demanding action, the discipline that once prevented catastrophe begins to calcify into identity. The danger of unintegrated rage is not volatility, but latency, a quiet accumulation of pressure beneath layers of self-control, where anger is not expressed, examined or metabolized, but stored, preserved by the very Jedi discipline meant to prevent its misuse, creating a paradox where control ensures survival while guaranteeing future rupture. Luke's post-war serenity therefore reads as conditional, dependent on circumstances remaining stable, and his self-image remaining intact, because the Jedi framework he adopts offers no tools for engaging fear once it resurfaces, only for suppressing it until it becomes unmanageable. This is why Luke's later disillusionment does not represent a betrayal of character, but a delayed consequence, the inevitable return of emotional material that was never addressed when it first surfaced in the throne room, now magnified by responsibility, legacy, and the impossible expectation that he embody perfection rather than humanity. By the time Luke attempts to rebuild the Jedi, he is not operating from wholeness but from containment, constructing an order around restraint and vigilance rather than integration and understanding, replicating the same structural blind spots that failed the Jedi before him because they align with his own unresolved fears. His terror of repeating Darth Vader's fall is rooted not only in history, but in self-recognition, an unspoken awareness that the darkness he witnessed in his father is not foreign to him, but familiar, and that familiarity frightens him precisely because he has never faced it directly. Rather than exploring that fear, Luke manages it through distance, rules, and moral absolutism, strategies that work only as long as no emotional shock pierces the system. And when that shock arrives, embodied in Ben Solo, the carefully maintained equilibrium collapses in an instant. The infamous moment of hesitation, often misread as sudden failure, is better understood as the catastrophic breach of decades of repression, a split second where buried fear and rage surge to the surface without warning, because they were never integrated, only restrained, and restraint always fails under sufficient pressure. Luke's immediate horror at himself in that moment confirms this reading, because his reaction is not confusion, but recognition, a sudden, devastating clarity that the darkness he feared was never defeated, only delayed, and that his identity, as a serene Jedi, was built on denial, rather than reconciliation. The aftermath of that realization drives Luke not toward reflection, but toward withdrawal, because introspection would require him to dismantle the entire philosophical scaffolding he has relied on since Endor, and without it, he has no framework left to understand himself. Exile becomes the final evolution of suppression, a geographic manifestation of emotional avoidance, where removing himself from the galaxy serves the same function discipline once did, preventing harm by eliminating proximity rather than cultivating understanding. On Ahch-To, Luke does not find peace, he finds stasis, a carefully controlled environment where nothing challenges the boundaries he has constructed, allowing him to exist without confronting the anger, fear, and shame that now define his internal landscape. His rejection of the Jedi during this period is often mistaken for enlightenment, but it is in fact exhaustion, the collapse of a belief system that demanded suppression without offering healing, leaving Luke with no language for growth beyond abandonment. What looks like wisdom in isolation is actually despair filtered through restraint, a man choosing disappearance over engagement because engagement risks exposure, and exposure risks confronting the truth he has avoided since the throne room, that darkness cannot be defeated by refusal alone. The Jedi ideal Luke once embraced taught him how to stop, but never how to heal, how to restrain impulse, but never how to integrate emotion, and that imbalance shapes every choice he makes afterward, from rebuilding the order in fear to abandoning it in shame. Seen through this lens, Luke's arc across the saga becomes tragically coherent. Not a story of regression, but of deferred reckoning, where each act of control postpones the inevitable confrontation with self, until avoidance is no longer sufficient to hold the structure together. Luke did not fail because he was weak, nor because he lacked compassion, but because he was taught that serenity meant silence, that anger was something to be buried rather than understood, and that victory meant suppression, rather than synthesis. True balance would have required Luke to accept his rage as part of himself, to examine it without judgment, and to integrate it into a broader emotional identity. But the Jedi framework available to him offered no such path, leaving him fluent in restraint and illiterate in reconciliation. The galaxy pays the price for this failure. Not because Luke becomes evil, but because unresolved darkness does not need to dominate to be destructive. It only needs to remain unexamined, shaping decisions from the shadows rather than the surface. In the end, Luke Skywalker does not defeat the dark side at Endor. He postpones it, locking it away beneath discipline and identity. And when the lock eventually fails, the consequences ripple outward, proving that peace built on denial is always temporary, and that enlightenment without integration is merely control wearing the mask of wisdom.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.